Hello and welcome to another episode of the CollabTalk podcast, where we discuss the convergence of technology, business productivity, and collaboration culture. My guest today is Mr. Kevin Eikenberry, Chief Potential Officer of the Kevin Eikenberry Group, a leadership and learning company. And today we're talking about, this is going to be a great topic. We're talking about how adaptable leaders thrive in uncertainty. Welcome, Kevin.
Well, thanks for having me, Christian. I'm glad to be here.
This is a great topic. It's one we touch on a lot in this show around change management, about, and especially around organizations that if they're good at change, that is a distinct competitive advantage to those that struggle with change. And so talking about adaptability is, I think, is fantastic. Why don't we start with, and I always like to say, expand on that very brief introduction I gave you of some of your background, who you are, some of what you do, and then also talk about your company, the Kevin Eikenberry Group. What's your primary focus? So yourself and your company.
So the Kevin Eikenberry Group, which, it's my name, so I suppose it's connected to me. We're in the business of making the world a better place by helping leaders be more effective. And we believe that and nothing gets better in the world without someone leading us there. Like we can devolve without help, but we can't evolve without someone leading, pointing away to that place. And so that's the business that we've been in for a very long time. That plays out, Christian, in lots of ways. I've written a bunch of books, including the one we're going to talk about today a little bit. And we've delivered all sorts of training, and I've done all sorts of speaking, and we've done coaching and all sorts of stuff. My team is spread out across the United States, and we've worked with leaders around the world. And we're in the leadership business, trying to help leaders make a bigger positive difference in the world.
So what are some of the common leadership challenges that you see that people are struggling with, currently? I'm sure there are trends. I'm sure there are things that have been continual problems over your career, but kind of what are the current themes of problem areas?
Well, I'm not sure that we could talk about the context that we live in and work in today, and that maybe makes the world a little different. But I think that the things that leaders have struggled with have honestly not changed all that much. There's way more that's the same than different. I know we're going to talk about change leadership, and I think actually everyone wants to talk about managing change, and I think what we really need to be doing is leading and championing change if we really want to be more successful with it. So certainly change is one, but we don't even have to go there. We can get far more basic than that, right? Like everyone who's listening or watching has had a leader that they've worked with or at least observed that really wasn't that great of a communicator, that didn't give very effective feedback, that wasn't a very effective coach, that wasn't empathetic. Like we could go right on down the line, and also wasn't very good at setting clear expectations and holding us to those and building an accountable culture. Like we could make a long list of things that we know that are important, and yet we don't always get better at. And again, I'm not sure, even though the context of today, the amount of uncertainty, the amount of complexity is certainly different, and building the wherewithal and the skill to lead through uncertainty, as you mentioned at the start, is critically important. I'm not sure that the biggest issues around leadership have changed all that much, because we're talking about humans leading humans, right? Yeah. Ultimately.
Well, I think that's a very important point there, is that, technology has always changed. I think even if we went back and looked at, somebody that started in a leadership position, middle management in the 50s, in the early 80s would have been like, wow, things have changed so much. Even though I do think that the scale of change, especially in technology, is dramatically, upticked since the mid 80s, certainly where I started being aware of technology and was involved as a teen into
Right.
my, the working world. Even when I started working in the early 90s, in fact, in 1991 until now, it's dramatically different, the technology that's there. But I see traits in managers, leaders that I've had, executives that I've worked with, that I found that I liked and disliked 30 years ago that are the same. Yeah.
And that's really the point that I'm making. There's no doubt that things are different, right? And this maybe gets us to talking about change too, but I think that here's what I believe one of the big mistakes that people make around changes is that they focus on what's changing and they don't say, okay, there's 12 steps in this process and we're changing 4 of them, but rather they say we're changing the process. And so like all the focus is on the change as opposed to recognizing that we're still standing and there's some things that are the same. And psychologically, when people understand that the change in the context of what's not changing, it makes it a lot easier to manage, right? And so, I think that sort of frames the why I started where I started. There's no doubt that a lot of things are different, and yet we sometimes need to be thinking about what's the same first to help us understand how to deal with the changes, as opposed to just throwing everything into the bucket of chaos. Oh my gosh, everything's changing. Well,
Yeah.
no, not everything is. The things that are changing are super important, right? I co-wrote a book back. Do you remember, Christian, back when Corona was still a beer? You remember that time?
When it was only a beer.
Well,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, when it was only a beer. And so before we'd heard of something called the coronavirus, COVID-19, we wrote a book called The Long Distance Leader in 2018. And in that book, we made this statement. We said that think leadership first, location second. And when we wrote the second edition of the book that came out last year, we didn't change that fact. And so, yes, the context has changed. Yes, we need to understand the context. Yes, we need to think about how the different technology tools, where, when, and how people are working. All of that's true, and yet so much is the same, and we got to make sure we're remembering that as well.
So you made a point that just made me think too. The word, talking about adaptability, and I want to get your definition of that. But it made me think of a lot of the work that I do around end user adoption of technology as an example. One of the best practices that we talk about all the time is that where you have more broadly accepted change, where adoption is stronger, is where the changes are integrated into their daily work practices. So it's about, you're not just abruptly saying you've been doing these 20 things every day, now you're going to do 20 completely different things. Like, that change doesn't stick if it's too abrupt. Even if that's the intention, let's say over the course of the year we're going to move on to these brand new systems. You don't just go say, stop doing this, now do it this way. You do this incremental change to slowly change the way that people are working so that they have time to, again, the word, adapt to that, evolve their thinking from that. Because the other side of that is if you do too abrupt of a change, again, these are my words, not Kevin's. We'll let Kevin talk to this, but is that you learn so much from those first steps. You may have had a plan, it's like, okay, you're going to do these 20 things, these new things. But when you implement the first 5 and integrate that in, you may learn about and change some of what will happen. And so that's why I think the rise of like the agile methodologies is his way of doing like shorter releases, like fewer changes, learn from it with the intention to change everything, but do it in this incremental manner, has been so much more successful in the end user adoption world. So, like, how do you define adaptability into what I just described?
Well, first of all, let me just say something about you said something really important. And so everyone who's watching or listening needs to go back and mentally highlight that. And that's the idea of next steps. Like, we don't necessarily need to know, people need to know, everyone needs to know what the overall plan is for the next 12 months in this change. But what they really need to know is, what am I going to do this week? And what am I going to do next week? What are the first and next steps? Not all the steps, all the way to the end. It's just like if I have a love-hate relationship with the Google Maps on this phone, right? And first of all, because I love actual maps and I like to have a bigger picture of where we're headed. But what this gets right is it tells us in 400 feet, you're going to change this. You're going to turn this way. In a quarter, and of course, depends on how fast you're going, right? If in a quarter of a mile, you're going to change here. It doesn't need to tell me the next 12 things that are going to happen for me to get from here to Pittsburgh or whatever. It just needs to give me the next one or the next couple. So I think that's a really super important point. So back to the bigger question, Christian, that you asked, you keep using the word adaptable. We would use the word flexible. The title of the new book is Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. And so when I think about being flexible, I think we could put adaptable in there because they're they're synonyms, right?
Mhm.
But one of the things that where people get stuck here is that from a leadership perspective, people say, well, don't we want people to be consistent? Don't we want people to be steady? Don't we want people to be a known quantity? And I would say there's truth in that. And yet, don't we need people to be flexible, pliant, and adapt? And the answer is that's true too. So the biggest of the ideas of flexible leadership is this: that we don't live in an either or world. We live in a both and world. And our job is to hold the tension between we need to make the change that's all the change a year from now. But the tension on that is, but we've got to talk about what we need to do in the next 2 weeks. Right? We have to have that big picture perspective, but we have to keep people rooted in what we can make a change a little bit at a time. So, from a leadership perspective, we would say that we all need to be rooted and steadfast in our principles, in our mission, in our values, and yet we need to be flexible on the approach that we take. And so, our big focus is on how do we move people past what they believe to be true about how they lead, and how do they do it how do they instead be flexible on approach, even though they're super clear and steadfast and consistent on those other rooted sorts of ideas.
Yeah, one of the phrases that I use all the time is around methodologies. Like, I don't care what methodology, what approach you have to solving a problem, like in project management, project management methodology. Just have a methodology so that you have a structured approach to doing that. I mean, that is the I look at that when you talk about that. That shows we're directionally correct. We know we're moving in the right direction. We don't know what this will look like a year from now. We have a vision of what that is, but we have our process or methodology, the steps that we go through. So as things changes, we go back and we look, we review, we adjust, we move forward. And one of my Buckleyisms that I say all the time, and my kids hate some of these phrases, but
But they'll remember them forever.
yeah, they do. They do. In fact, I caught my oldest son that used a couple of my phrases. It was great, and I called him on it. I think that was where I overstepped. I should have just let it go.
You just need
But
to smile and feel the
that's
self-satisfaction
right.
then.
That's right. But it was the like you cannot. What was it? The phrase like you. So I'll paraphrase myself. But it was you cannot measure what is not moving forward. Meaning you have to take action. You have to move. You can't measure something that is stopped. And so that's where I say if we're directionally correct, and there's I had one of my professors in my master's program who became an advisor for my first startup, and he's still a good friend, Art Close. Remember, he talked about, he says, what is the purpose of management? The purpose of management is to make the decisions, like where you started. Like, somebody has to make a decision at some point. You collect the information that you have, you get the best information, most accurate, most timely, then make a decision. So then you can move forward. You can adjust once you start moving forward, read the measures. Okay, it's slightly veering. Let's adjust for this, course correct, and go again, adjust, course correct around that. But you have to be moving forward. You have to be doing something, taking action.
Yeah, for sure. And quite honestly, everything you just said is exactly right. And there's a lot of folks that don't that they make the decision and then they're done. Like, okay, I have decreed it, I have made it, we are done. All I want is everyone to comply with what I've decided, and you'll do that because I'm the boss. And if we're not willing to do what you're doing, which is to measure and look, to continue to adapt and flex based on what you're learning as you're doing it, then we're not going to ultimately be successful. And yet we both know, and everyone who's watching and listening know lots of leaders that are exactly in that. That's exactly what they do.
Well, it's the old waterfall method approach. Again, taking it back to project management terms, but is that like the 3-year project where we had the vision, we did the scope, we got the budget all based on that. 3 years later, what's delivered, it might have met that scope 3 years ago. Nobody wants that anymore. It doesn't now fit what the business needs. I mean, I recognize that as a young PM 30 years ago. Like, there's something fundamentally wrong here with
Yep.
this model. And and there's all the other terms that are in there, scope creep and things around. There's like, no, well, that's why You can't put all of your eggs in that basket. I think it's just the wrong way to look at solving problems. Is what we talked about. Like if I, judged my, or judged is the wrong word, but if I looked at, conversations I had with my kids when they were younger and said, now that they're, grown adults, be like, boy, you're way off your plan. It's like, Dad, that was when I was 10 years old. I had that vision. It's like, yeah, you didn't stick to it. You're not.
What? You're not a fireman?
That's right. Yeah, but I mean, that's part of that. We do that in our own lives. We are flexible and adapt to the changes that are around us. Why is it there's that disconnect? Why is it when we go into organizational practices, into companies, that we become more rigid around those changes?
Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, I'll give you one that I think is really a challenge, and that is that we get promoted into leadership roles because we were really good at something, right? Now, it may not be we were really good at leading, but we were really good at something. Like we were good accountants and we became the accounting manager. We were good technologists and we became the IT manager, right? So but we were good at something that we were recognized for and that we were promoted for. And so we sort of feel like in order for us to be good in this new job, we're supposed to know everything. And we carry this mantle on our shoulders of needing to know it. And so then that leads us to say that my job as a leader is to have the answers. And that means that I'm going to do what you said earlier. I'm going to collect the data if I even need to, because I already know. And then I'm going to make a decision. And that's my job. And I've now done my job. And my job is to have the right answer. But what you've described, and we've talked about here already, is that there isn't always a right answer. There isn't even always a best answer. There's a range of possible, plausible, good answers. And we might not even have the context of our situation might be complex enough that we don't even know what we don't know in order to come to best. And so we oversimplify and we act as if our context is clear and we just decide. As leaders, we feel like in many cases that's what we're supposed to do because that's what we were good at before and that's what got us promoted. So what we need to do instead is to say, like, the world isn't what it was when I was doing the work, number one, which also leads us to then try to keep staying up to date with all of that data when we're not actually doing the work.
Right.
And now we don't even have our eyes on the right prize anymore, right? Which is to look higher, look deeper, look further, rather than to get into the weeds, so to speak.
That's a big struggle. In fact, I had a recent conversation, did an episode for talking about leaders, so managers that have a difficult time letting go of their individual contributor perspective in that role and doing that. You feel like they have to do everything. And years ago, I wrote an article about the myth of the well-rounded employee, this super employee that could do all those things, even, everything, was good at everything. And not to say there aren't those people. There are some of those people that are just good at everything that they do, and good luck hanging on to those folks. But the reality is that there are things that we're good at. There are things that we're passionate about, that we excel at, exceedingly well, and other things where we do what we can to move it forward. But again, back to this point, it's difficult for a lot of leaders to let go of that IC perspective, that individual contributor perspective.
Yeah. And you know what? And the thing is, it's understandable. And if you find yourself in that spot, you need to grant yourself some grace, because psychologically it's easy to go there and it's easy to stay there. And you're not the only one that's there. And that's why all of us have seen a whole lot of folks in our lives that were micromanagers, even if they didn't think they were, and in most cases didn't want to be. And so if you find yourself in that spot of how do I move myself out of that individual contributor, subject matter expert sort of role, number one, take a deep breath and grant yourself some grace to say, hey, that happens. It's happened to me. It's not uncommon. Now what do I need to do? What I need to do. And so here's the question. It's not, could I do that or can I do that? The question is that the best use of my time from the perspective of the organization and the team? It's not whether we can. And even if we're not the best at it, even if we're just really good at it, it's not whether we can, it's whether we should. Is that the best use of our time? That's where we have to get out of. In flexible leadership, we talk about we have to have the intention to say that what's natural to us, what's our natural habit, maybe even what we've determined or it's been found to be our style, we have to be able to move past that. Because if we stay there, we stay in auto response, we stay in automatic, and there's no chance for us to adjust. There's no chance for us to adapt. There's no chance for us to flex, because now we're living in the identity that we've given to ourselves, which is I'm the leader that's supposed to know it all. I'm the leader that's this kind of leader or that kind of leader. This is my style. These are my strengths. But rather, okay, sometimes going on our auto response, going on our natural habit or past experience will be great in this context. Other times, not so much. And so stopping long enough to ask ourselves and think, what's the best answer? What's the best approach for me to take right now? Not what would I naturally do?
What you've just described, like I understand that. What I recognize is that's difficult for a lot of managers. And I went through a leadership development program years ago, about 15 years ago, that was psychology based. It was actually started by a psychologist by practice, a technical project manager, actually worked at Boeing for 15 years or so. And the other one, is a good friend, was a trained psychiatrist. So on went the medical route of that side of it. They
Mm-hmm.
did this leadership development. It was very much, going down and looking at personality types, and the concept of this program called Pathwise Leadership was, if you understand yourself, your style, your how you lead, you recognize that, and then start to understand the other personality styles that are out there. And then for me to know how personality style A works best with personality style B, and then to do that. And in practice, I mean, it's just, it opened up my eyes to that. But a key to that entire process was being self-aware, one, taking the time to kind of step back, pause, and look at that. And because, if you're in the midst of huge projects, giant organization, all this change that's happening, that role, taking the time to be self-aware, it seems to be a cornerstone of beginning to be flexible, adaptable around that. How can leaders cultivate that? Like, what guidance do you provide with leaders to be more self-reflecting, to be able to start that process?
Well, so here's the thing, that the idea of being self-reflective, first of all, I would say that anyone who wants to be a more effective leader, if they will work on reflection, self-reflection or not, if they'll work on reflecting on what happened and whether it worked or whether it didn't, and what do I do based on what I just learned, you do that one thing and you'll become a more effective leader if you're open enough to that. But what I would say is, in front of self-awareness, or before we can even get to that, is intention. The intention that says, I'm not going to do my natural style until I determine that's the right answer or the best answer right now, right? So my advice always is, recognize that let's just do it this way. You have a natural style, all of you listening. You have a natural leadership style. You may have taken some sort of course, some sort of assessment that says, here's your style. Here are your strengths. You may have taken it something very specifically on leadership. You may have taken a Myers-Briggs, a DISC, any number of things. Like, here's my style. Fine. Now, if you identify as that's now who I am, and you say, well, I'm going to be consistent around that thing. Here's my question. If even if you stay in that lane and you're going to lead in that way, in a world that's ever changing, is it a good bet that the world is going to move in the direction that's in alignment with your personal status quo? Not very likely, right? The math doesn't even make sense for that, right? So the point that I would make is all we have to do first is to say, I have to realize that number one, the most effective way to lead requires me to flex. And if you just come to say that makes sense to me, then we can say in any situation, we can take a breath and say, here's what I was going to do. Is that the best answer or not? Is that the answer that gives me the best chance of success? Because here's the thing, Christian, in the role of being a leader, everything we do is influence, right? So everything is about you could think about, like Annie Duke says, thinking in bets. You could say, like, how would I place my bet in terms of where I can have the most influence? Because leadership is about outcomes and other people, and all of that we can't control, we can only influence. So ultimately, it's like, what's the best approach? Or based on what I know, what's the best approach I can take? And sometimes that might be doing it the way I'm most comfortable, but not all the time, right? So your point about self-reflection, super, super important, but it really comes before that to just say, am I aware that it's not possible that my approach is always going to be the best one? Like, it's just not possible, right? So if I can get to that spot, and then I can be intentional about taking the instant, the hour, or the day before I do the next thing as a leader, to, how much time do I need to think about what I need to do? And it doesn't have to be, I'm now going to take 3 days to think about this. It could just be, I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to think for a second before I take my next step. It doesn't have
Yeah,
to be big. It can
right.
be little. And it starts with intentionally saying it's worth considering flexing.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons. And again, I'm not advocating for any specific methodology,
Mhm.
but having that structure, because you have the things that you're comfortable and uncomfortable with, the things that are your strengths and your weaknesses in that methodology. It really is more of a, have I done this? Have I asked this question? Have I got this perspective of things? And if you follow that, I mean, so I'm a big fan of the book First Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham, and like that, it's fantastic. Like, that is something that I just really resonates with me. And I used to always say that I've done this several times in different roles, where I found myself as the manager of the island of misfit toys, of people that were, extremes in certain ways, and part of my job as manager was to determine what's needed for this project and then put the right team together for that. It's not always just around the bandwidth of the individual. It's like knowing this is I need this person's strength. Yes, they're over allocated. We'll see what we can do to adjust. That's one of the things about that a
Yeah.
manager does, a leader does. Um, but again, is to be ready. I love the phrase, like my kids would always say this, like, we can do hard things. Like, we can, but it's easier when you've got that structure, that
Yeah.
approach to it. And so that you to make sure that you're not just, as we do, become blind to the things which we don't like doing, but that need to be done.
Everything that we're talking about during this conversation is hard because we are asking ourselves or intentionally saying to ourselves, we're not going to automatically do what comes automatic, right? And so, and to your point of what your kids say, we can do hard things. It's easier to do hard things when you have a framework. And so that's really what ultimately you and I have been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so, is the idea that is flexing or adapting helpful? Yes. And we've got to give ourselves permission to do it. And then we have to take the curious mind to say, we're going to try stuff. We're
Yeah.
going to try stuff
Yeah.
and see if that got us a good result. And if it did, let's do more of that. And if it didn't, what do I need to tweak? And it doesn't mean we have to change everything. It means we need to continue to work at the margin around making those adjustments.
I love the model that was described in the very important American film, What About Bob? Of baby stepping, where he's tied to the mast. I'm sailing, I'm sailing. Yeah, but that idea of taking complex things and breaking it up. And I found myself saying this over and over again when my kids were younger and studying and frustrated at the scope and scale of something that they needed to work on, and saying, break it up into its components, stretch that out. Let's do it today. You're just focusing on this
Yep.
piece. You're not trying to do all of it at once. And I find I'm do that myself, where I'm a list guy. I'd like constantly have, notepads, task lists, the things that are out there using the
Wait a
technology.
minute.
Yeah.
You're a technologist and you use paper?
Yes, I do. There's a method to that. Yeah.
Well, I'm right with you. I'm just teasing you. I'm just teasing you.
I define my mind works too fast for my ability to type and input in the tools, but then there's other times that I'm offline, so I always have a spiral bound, a notepad, something or other where I capture that. I was at a doctor's appointment this morning, and I texted myself information. I thought of it as, hey, this would add into that, and I have using the technology to send reminders so it's in my inbox when I get back. Oh yeah, let me grab that. Go do that thing. But yeah,
I'm right with you. I do the same thing. I took you off track. I'm sorry,
no,
but I
it's all right.
couldn't resist in this conversation that you held up a piece of
Well,
paper. I do the same thing. I've been wanting to figure out how to not use paper for 30 years.
Well, there's
I
other
was one of
cool
the first people I know
technologies.
to buy a laptop. Like,
Well, there are tools that are out there. There's like the Remarkable tablet, which is
I have
fantastic.
one of those.
Yeah. But it's still a blend. So I'm the same. I've got the different tools. I use them at different times, and there's nothing wrong with then and aggregating that. I've got a process for that. But well, I think this kind of speaks to my next question about finding a balance. Like, how do you advise or recommend to leaders? How do they balance their strengths and their leadership styles with that need to be flexible?
Yeah, it goes back to it's a both and, right? So, do we need to know our strengths? Yes. Do we need to know our weaknesses? Yes. Does that mean we only lean into strengths? I say no, right? Should we improve our strengths? Sure. Should we work on our weaknesses? Yes. And most people want to do one or the other, right? And they'll either try to work on strengths and ignore the weaknesses. That's the recipe for disaster. Or, hey, I'm going to work on my weaknesses. And as I work on my weaknesses, my strengths will atrophy. So the
Right.
reality is that we live in a both and world, right? And so for us to balance, to use your word, is to understand the symbiotic nature of things that we're working on, whether it's strengths and weaknesses or something else. And it isn't about finding the perfect place. It's about being willing to adjust or shift within that continuum we would call a flexor. So let's just take the example of an example we often use when we use the word balance. We talk about work-life balance, which I think is a total misnomer, right? And so, like, if you're an accountant, you're a public accountant, and you're not going to have what most people call work-life balance that second half of March and the first half of April. Like, you're just not. You're going to be leaning far into the work side of your life, but that might be different at the end of July. Does that mean that because there's not a place, there's our need to be willing to shift along the continuum of the tension to help us be more successful. So I don't want anyone to hear that, even though I think there are problems with us leaning too deeply, thinking too much about leadership strengths. I am not saying or leadership styles. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with leadership styles. I'm saying leadership styles are great until they're not. And when they're not is when that becomes our focus. Are they a component of how we lead and understand ourselves as leaders? 100%. But if they become our identity, we're not balancing now. Now we're trying to oversimplify a complex world.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the role of the leaders who seem adaptable, flexible, and yet are very difficult to get them to look at their decision-making process. I mean, how are flexible leaders? What's different about their approach to decision-making?
Well, their approach to decision making starts with what's the context of our situation. Like, if the context is clear and everybody knows that there are knowns, and we can lean into that person that has that knowledge, which may be us as the leader, then the decision is, I'm going to make a decision. The people will be fine with it, and we move on. Right.
Yeah.
And if things are truly chaotic, which they rarely are, but if things are truly chaotic by the model that we would talk about, that where there are unknown things that are unknown, like it's truly chaotic, then what people want is for someone to just decide something, pick something, we'll follow if you just tell us what we should do, because we don't know where we're immobilized. So
Yeah.
in those cases, the approach of us as the leader to take charge and say, we're going this way, makes a great deal of sense. But if the world is more complicated, or if your situation is more complex, you need much more input than you can have yourself. And if it's truly complex, you don't not only need input, but you need to all be willing to know that we don't know everything. We're gonna have to try stuff. So like how we decide even depends on the context. And so when we think about, and we've now talked about all three of these parts, but when we think about being a flexible leader, we say that it's intent plus context plus flexors. And we've now talked, Christian, about all three of those things.
Yeah. There's another Buckleyism that I use, and you've kind of mentioned this, and I'll just rephrase in the Buckleyism phrasing. It's the more you involve people in the process, the more likely people will support that process. And it doesn't mean that everybody's happy with the answer of that. But if you go to a leader and share the information that here's my feedback on that, and they say, look, I understand that. Here's my perspective. You don't have this other piece. Here's why we're not going to do that. Thank you for that input. That's very valuable. You've helped us on this, but this is why we're moving in this direction. Even though they just got shot down, that individual will be like, okay, I was heard. There's transparency here. I was involved in it. And I understand that, why we're moving forward. Even if I disagree on my piece of that, I understand.
Yep.
And that's something that I've found in my experience is rare in leaders to provide that kind of feedback. Well, not just leaders, support teams,
Humans.
feedback to process. Yeah,
Humans.
humans. And dealing with humans, I find that that's lacking. Responding back and saying, thank you for your feedback. Here's why we're not going to move forward. Or, thank you. Hey, that's great. It actually aligns with what we were already planning. And here's where that is. That positive feedback is also not shared very often.
No, and that's 100% true. And if we will do those things that you've just described, we have the chance, or have a much better chance, of creating commitment and not just compliance.
Well, what is the role of, because this, what I was describing, and this is an important part of it, is around communication. What role does communication play in fostering a flexible leadership style?
Well, I always say that if you can't communicate your way out of a paper bag, you're not going to be a very effective leader. Like it's a fatal flaw if you can't communicate, right? And back to where we started at the beginning of this conversation, Christian, if you go back to when I started in business, which is before you started, because you said when you started, and I started sooner than that. We didn't have as many media in which we needed to be able to, or even had the ability to communicate in, right? When I started my company 31 years ago, I had a fax machine, right? And
I ran a fax-based service for my first tech company in 91. Yeah.
So the reality is that for us as leaders, if we're in the business of creating valuable outcomes, that means we have to be able to communicate what those outcomes are, why those outcomes matter, who those outcomes matter to, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not doing it alone. We're doing it with other people. So leadership is about outcomes, but it's also about others. And so that means it's all about communication. And the challenge is that we have so many mediums that we can use, so many tools in our communication toolkit, that it was hard enough to do when we just had a phone and a face. Now we got all these other tools, including the one you and I are using right now. We've not physically met, may never physically meet, and yet we've had to figure out a way to have a successful communication for 40 minutes, right? And so there's no way, call it flexible leadership, call it any kind of leadership, that we can talk about leading without focusing on communicating, because it's critical, foundational to our success.
I know one of the I think a great sign of leadership that I had one with a product leader was at an event, and one of the things that he stated was, he says, look, we wanted to balance, like, what do we share about our roadmap, and this was like all under NDA discussion for kind of influencers, and he said, we've decided that we want to communicate and share, erring on the side of too much information to give you. But they did it having vehicles in place, knowing that, hey, we're going to get much more feedback in different formats from this. So they prepared for that, but they said, we're the benefits versus the risks of talking too early, getting people excited about features as product companies of, features that might never become a reality, but these are the things that we're thinking about. So much more creative input for the things that are out there, and help them make final decisions, ultimately. And so that was a lesson learned, and we talked about it. Those that were in the room for this, hundreds of us as part of this, talked about like having it wide open and talking about what's possible and giving us greater input, or at least the illusion of greater input, got us so much more bought into the rest of the process. And again, I go back to my Buckleyism. The more that we're involved in that, the more accepting we are of the process and the end result of that process, because we were involved.
And that's a perfect example of the flexor we would call the share withhold flexor, right? Like the way you described how the organization and those folks made the decision, like they might have said, my natural inclination might have been to withhold this, or the lawyers might have said, we ought to withhold this, or whatever, right? Yeah. And so they managed the tension between how much do we share and how much do we withhold. And they thought about it in the context of their situation, what their goals were. And then they went to that place on that continuum, which might not have been their natural response, might not have been even the safest response. And yet it's the one that they chose. That is an example of leading, in that case, communicating in a flexible way based on the context. Different situation, different group of people, 2 months earlier, 2 months later, they might have made a different decision about how much to share or withhold. But in that moment, they consciously thought about that, which led them to the choice that you described.
Yeah. I would say that was 9 years ago. They've since gone back to their much more, close the kimono. They're more controlled at what they share. And and so but again, looking at it, if you were open-minded, not just focus on, hey, it's different. Like, yeah, it's different, but also the time, the era, the point in time that was, they needed to do that. That where I see their perspective, like they don't need to do that as open now. But yeah, it's, again, it goes back to the kind of that there's the self-awareness, there's the macro awareness of the environment and the need for those things. But yeah, on the communication side of that. I mean, I think it's leaders who are have poor communication skills. They can have the best intentions. It could be the right plan, but how many projects fail in the execution? It had nothing to do with the decision was made or the technology, the process, or all those things, but fail in the execution. Communication is a huge part of that execution of whatever it is.
100% true.
What's your advice to leaders who struggle with over communicating or under communicating during times of change?
Well, I think during times of change, man, most of the time I would on that scale, I would want to be leaning towards sharing versus not sharing. Yeah. And here's the reason why, because when people don't know, they're going to make it up. And so I'm going to share as much as I can share as soon as I feel like I can share it, because if I'm not doing that, they're making it up. And you all know what happens once gossip or rumors start about something, that even when the facts are available, now you don't just have to explain something, you have to overcome what people have believed to be true, which is the thing they've heard for the last 6 weeks, right? So think about it this way, that gossip is like a mushroom, it grows in the dark. And so when people don't know, they're going to make it up because they're trying to figure it out. It's like in The Wizard of Oz, when and this is a spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie, right? But you get near the end and Dorothy and her troop are in there, and they're in there, and they're listening to the great and powerful Oz. There's this flashing sound thing on the wall, and there's booming voice, and they are shaking because they are uncertain. They don't know what it is going on. They don't know what to think about this dude, the great and powerful Oz, except for Toto the dog pulls down the curtain, and it's a dude with a megaphone. And once you know, we're like, oh, well, we can deal with that. We can figure that out. And yet too often we stay behind the curtain longer than we need to. Yes, there are times we can't share everything immediately. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that if you will tell people, you'll tell them everything you can when you can, you will dissipate some of that anxiety. You will reduce some of the worry that comes with uncertainty, and you'll start to build trust with you as the leader.
Final question for you. This is I always like to ask kind of a forward looking future, or like kind of one key piece of advice here is like what is that key piece of advice that you'd give to leaders who want to thrive in an uncertain world?
Well, I would say whether you're thinking about the ideas we've talked about today, flexible leadership, or whatever it is that you've learned on a podcast, in a workshop, whatever it is, like, here's what I would say. All of us have listened to a show, read a book, been to a workshop, and been excited. We had new tools that we had in our toolkit, and we were ready to go use them. But too often they become dusty and rusty because we never actually use them. So what I would encourage you, whatever it is that you've got that you've been wanting to try, you have to pass the knowing doing gap. And that means whatever it is, go try it, because you're never going to become more effective. You're never going to build your confidence as a leader if you sit around and wait and think, or think about trying something, or just living based on your natural habits and auto responses. You have to be willing to try the stuff you're learning. And if you do that, you have a chance to make a bigger difference.
Yeah, it made me think of like when I was working on my MBA, it was all of the projects, all of the work. I would use real work projects and apply what I was learning at those things. And I think so much more of it sunk in there. And I was able to go back and reuse those skills with my first startup, and things like that. But it's because it's one thing to read and comprehend, it's another one to practically apply those things.
100%.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for participating in this episode of the CollabTalk podcast. And for those that are watching or listening to the show, you can find Kevin's contact details on the post in my blog and buckleyplanet.com, and on my YouTube channel under the same name. This includes the Kevin Eikenberry company website and a link to his book, Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. Thank you again, Kevin, for your time.
Christian, it was a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me. I'll just say, if I can say one more thing,
yeah,
that is that I've got a gift for everyone who's chosen to listen to us or watch us to the end. If you go to kevineikenberry.com/gift, I've got a free gift for you there. It's our masterclass that we created about being more confident and building the confidence in others. And it ties into some of the ideas we've talked about today, and that is available to you for free. Just go to kevineikenberry.com/gift, and some more of the stuff about the book is on that page as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the CollabTalk podcast. New episodes are published weekly, and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and most other podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.